She was just 5 years old when tragedy struck, not once, but repeatedly throughout her entire life. This is the story of Caroline Kennedy, the woman who survived America's most famous family curse. In November 1963, a 5-year-old girl stood before the world and saluted her father's coffin. The image would become one of the most iconic photographs in American history, a single moment that captured a nation's grief and a child's impossible loss. She was Caroline Kennedy, daughter of President John F. Kennedy, born into America's most famous family at the height of their power. But this is not a story about the Kennedy presidency or political legacy. This is the story of one woman's journey through unimaginable tragedy, repeated loss, and the quiet strength it takes to survive when the world watches your every tear. For nearly 7 decades, Caroline Kennedy has endured what would break most people. And yet, she continues to live with dignity, grace, and an almost superhuman resilience. Her story is not about curses or fate. It is about what it means to be human in the face of unbearable loss. Welcome to the tragic life of Caroline Kennedy, a woman who lost everything and chose to live anyway. Caroline Kennedy was born on November 27, 1957, at New York Hospital in Manhattan. She entered the world as the daughter of a young, ambitious senator named John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a man who would reshape American politics and become one of the most transformative leaders of the 20th century. But on that November day in 1957, he was simply a father holding his newborn daughter. Caroline's early childhood was one of extraordinary privilege, though not yet extraordinary fame. Her father was a senator from Massachusetts, a decorated war hero, and a rising star in the Democratic Party. Her mother was Jacqueline Lee Bouvier Kennedy, a woman of grace, intelligence, and impeccable style. The Kennedy family was old money, East Coast aristocracy, connected to the most powerful circles of American life. Caroline grew up in comfortable homes in New York and Washington. She had nannies, tutors, and access to the finest education that money could buy. She had a younger brother, John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., born in 1960, 2.5 years after her. The two children seemed to have the world at their feet. Their father was ambitious and charismatic. Their mother was elegant and beloved. They lived a life that most American children could only dream about, a life of privilege, possibility, and promise. But even in those early years, there was a shadow lurking on the horizon. Their father's ambitions grew larger. In 1960, at age 43, John F. Kennedy decided to run for the highest office in the land. He would run for President of the United States. The campaign was fierce and competitive. His opponent was Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president, who had far more political experience. But Kennedy had something else. He had youth, charisma, and a vision of a better America. He had the ability to inspire people. On November 8, 1960, America went to the polls. The election was one of the closest in American history. But when the votes were counted, John F. Kennedy had won. At age 43, he would become the youngest elected president in American history. Caroline was just 3 years old. She had no idea that her life was about to change in ways that she could never have imagined. On January 20, 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he spoke words that would define a generation. "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It was a moment of hope, of possibility, of youth and idealism taking the helm of the world's most powerful nation. And that moment would change everything for Caroline Kennedy. 3-year-old Caroline moved into the White House along with her mother, her baby brother John Jr., and her infant sister Caroline would have if she had been born earlier. Actually, Caroline had no other siblings yet, just baby John Jr. The White House became her home. Not a house where the president happened to live, but her actual childhood home. She ran through the halls of power. She played in the Rose Garden while world leaders conferred inside. She rode her pony on the White House grounds. The media fell in love with the president's children. They were young, beautiful, and represented the future of America. Photographs of Caroline and John Jr. Playing, laughing, and living in the White House became iconic images of the era. The American people loved them. They represented innocence, hope, and the promise of a new generation. The era became known as Camelot, after the legendary kingdom from Arthurian legend. A magical place where anything seemed possible, where youth and idealism held sway, where the future looked bright and full of promise. For Caroline Kennedy, these were golden years. She had access to the most educated and accomplished people in the world. She heard conversations about history, politics, literature, and philosophy. Her father was not simply a political figure. He was a voracious reader, a man of intellectual curiosity, who valued intelligence and wit above almost everything else. He would spend time with his children when he could, though the demands of the presidency were enormous. Caroline would later remember her father reading to her, playing with her, making her feel loved despite the impossible demands on his time. Her mother, Jackie, was equally devoted to creating a normal life for her children despite the extraordinary circumstances. Jackie understood that Caroline and John Jr. were children first and future public figures second. She hired the best tutors. She created spaces in the White House where the children could play freely, away from the cameras and the constant scrutiny. She fought fiercely to protect their privacy and their childhood. These were years of privilege beyond measure. Years when Caroline Kennedy lived in a fairy tale, when the world seemed full of possibility, when her father was the most powerful man on earth and her family seemed untouchable. During the Kennedy presidency, which lasted from 1961 to 1963, the American public developed an almost obsessive fascination with the first family. Magazines featured photographs of Caroline and John Jr. constantly. The media wanted to know what the president's children were doing, what they wore, what schools they attended, what their daily routines were like. There was something almost mythological about the way America loved the Kennedy children. They represented the future. They were the children of Camelot, born into a world of privilege and power that most people could only imagine. Caroline Kennedy, despite her youth, seemed to embody everything that was good about the Kennedy presidency. She was intelligent, poised, and beautiful. She had her mother's grace and her father's intelligence. Photographs from this era show a happy, confident child, a girl who seemed comfortable in her own skin, who smiled easily, who appeared to have the world at her feet. She attended Miss Porter's school, one of the most exclusive preparatory schools in the country. She learned French and other languages. She was taught history and literature by some of the best educators in America. Her life was being carefully curated to prepare her for the role she seemed destined to play, the daughter of an American president, a member of one of the most famous families in the world. Her brother, John Jr., was growing up in the same environment. The two children would sometimes appear together in photographs and newsreels, the young prince and princess of America, products of Camelot, the hope of the future. The American people loved them almost as if they were their own children. There was an innocence to this time, a sense that the world was good, that the future was bright, that tragedy was something that happened to other people, in other times, in other places. Caroline Kennedy had no way of knowing that she was living in borrowed time, that the happiness of these years was fragile, that everything was about to change in ways that would define the rest of her life. November 22, 1963, began like any other day. President Kennedy was in Texas, conducting a political trip to shore up support in a state that was important to his re-election campaign in 1964. He was riding in a motorcade through Dallas, waving to crowds, shaking hands, doing what presidents do when they travel the country. Caroline Kennedy was at school. She was 6 years old now. She had just turned 6 on November 27, which was coming up in a few days. She had no idea that her father was in danger. She had no idea that she was about to lose him. At 12:30 in the afternoon in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, shots rang out. President John F. Kennedy was hit. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but it was too late. The doctors did everything they could, but the president had suffered a fatal wound. At 1:00 p.m. Central Time, President John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. The news spread like a shock wave across America. In offices, factories, schools, and homes, Americans learned that their president had been assassinated. The nation came to a halt. People wept in the streets. School children were sent home. The entire country was plunged into a state of collective trauma and grief. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., at her school, Caroline Kennedy was told that her father was dead. The exact details of how Caroline learned the news vary depending on the source. But what is certain is that a 6-year-old girl was told that the man she loved, the man who was the most important person in her life, was gone. She would never see him again. She would never hear his voice again. She would never feel his hand on her head or hear him read to her before bed. The loss was absolute. It was total. It was the kind of loss that shapes a human being forever. In the days following the assassination, the Kennedy family was thrust into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. The nation was grieving. The world was in shock. And the Kennedy family, Jackie, Caroline, and John Jr., had to navigate their private grief in the most public way possible. Jackie Kennedy, the First Lady, suddenly became the widow of an assassinated president. She had to make decisions about the funeral, about how to honor her husband, about how to protect her children while the entire world watched. Caroline and John Jr. were shielded as much as possible, but there was no way to completely shield them. The house was filled with grown-ups who were grieving. There was a sense of loss and chaos that permeated everything. Jackie made the decision to have a state funeral for her husband, a funeral that would be watched by millions of people around the world. She wanted to honor his service, his sacrifice, and his vision for America. But she also had to protect her children from the full weight of this public grieving. On November 25, 1963, 3 days after the assassination, the nation said goodbye to President Kennedy. His coffin was placed on a caisson, a horse-drawn cart used for state funerals, and carried through the streets of Washington. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets, many of them weeping. World leaders came from every corner of the globe to pay their respects. The funeral was carried live on television, watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. It was one of the most watched events in human history at that time. And at the center of it all, in front of the cameras, in front of the world, were Caroline Kennedy, age 6, and John F. Kennedy Jr., age 3. Caroline was dressed in a pink coat and hat. She held her mother's hand. And then came the moment that would define her life forever. As her father's coffin was being carried to its final resting place at Arlington National Cemetery, Jackie Kennedy bent down and whispered something to her 6-year-old daughter. Whatever she said, Caroline understood. She stepped forward. She saluted. It was a simple gesture, a child's salute to her father. But captured by the cameras, broadcast to the world, it became something far more significant. It became an image of innocence lost. It became a symbol of a nation's grief. It became a moment that would be replayed for generations to come, that would be taught in schools, that would be remembered as long as America remembered its history. That photograph of 6-year-old Caroline Kennedy saluting her father's coffin would win the Pulitzer Prize for photography. It would become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It would define not just a moment, but an entire era of American history. And for Caroline Kennedy, it would define her identity in ways that she could never have anticipated. From that moment forward, she would not simply be Caroline Kennedy, daughter of a president. She would be the girl who saluted her father's coffin. She would be the symbol of a nation's grief. She would be the face of tragedy. And she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. For the rest of her life. After November 22, 1963, Caroline Kennedy's childhood was fundamentally transformed. She was no longer simply a president's daughter living in the White House. She was now the daughter of an assassinated president, a child marked by tragedy, a symbol of national grief. The world watched her with a mixture of sympathy and morbid fascination. People wanted to see how she would cope. They wanted to know if she would be strong like her mother. They wanted to understand how a 6-year-old could survive such a loss. But Caroline was not a symbol to be analyzed. She was a child who had just lost her father, and she had to learn how to live in a world without him. The White House was no longer her home. Just weeks after the assassination, Jackie Kennedy made the decision to leave the White House and move her family to New York City. She could not bear to stay in the place where her husband had lived, where his presence haunted every room, where she would be constantly reminded of what she had lost. In New York, she rented a townhouse on the Upper East Side, in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. It was an attempt to create normalcy, to shield her children from the constant scrutiny, to allow them to grow up as much like normal children as possible under the circumstances. But there was no such thing as normal for Caroline Kennedy anymore. Everywhere she went, people stared. They knew who she was. They knew what had happened to her. They whispered about her. Some people approached her with genuine sympathy. Others treated her like she was something to gawk at, a living reminder of that tragic November day. Jackie was fiercely protective of her children. She fought with the media to protect their privacy. She hired security to keep photographers away. She arranged for Caroline and John Jr. to attend school under assumed names. She did everything she could to create a buffer between her children and the world that wanted to consume them. But even with all of these protections, Caroline could not escape the reality of her loss. She could not escape the fact that her father was gone. She could not escape the questions that came up constantly, questions about what happened, questions about her father, questions about how she was coping. Her memories of her father were limited by her age. She had only known him for 6 years. She had no adult memories of him. What she had were fragments, the sound of his voice, the feeling of being held by him, certain moments that stood out with unusual clarity while others were lost to time. She had to rely on photographs, on films, on other people's stories to understand who her father had been. In some ways, this was perhaps a blessing. She did not have to grieve the man her father might have become, the president he might have been for another term or more. She grieved the father she had known, the man who had read to her, played with her, made her feel loved despite the impossible demands on his time. School became a refuge for Caroline. At school, she could be just another student, at least for a few hours a day. Her teachers tried to treat her as normally as possible, though they were always aware of her loss, always gentle with her, always watchful for signs that she was struggling. Caroline was an intelligent student. She was curious and engaged. She seemed determined to do well, perhaps as a way of honoring her father's memory, or perhaps simply because she was a bright child who loved learning. Her brother John Jr. was 3 years younger, only 3 years old when their father died. He had even fewer memories of the president than Caroline did. In some ways, his loss was even more profound because he would grow up with almost no direct memories of his father. He would know his father primarily through photographs, through stories, through the legend that the Kennedy presidency had become in American history. The two children had each other. They had the shared experience of losing their father in the same public, traumatic way. They had the shared experience of growing up in the shadow of an assassinated president. In some ways, they were the only two people in the world who could truly understand what it meant to be them. The children of JFK, born into privilege, thrust into tragedy, forever marked by the events of November 1963. Jackie Kennedy emerged from the assassination as one of the most beloved figures in American history. The way she had conducted herself during those terrible days, her dignity, her grace, her strength, had inspired the nation. People saw her as a symbol of American resilience. They respected her. They wanted to protect her and her children from further harm. But Jackie knew something that the American public did not fully understand. Protecting her children would require constant vigilance, constant sacrifice, and constant decisions about what kind of life they would have. She had to decide how public or private they would be. She had to decide whether to allow them to be photographed, to be interviewed, to be part of the ongoing Kennedy narrative. She had to decide how much of their father's legacy they would inherit, how much they would be burdened by his name and his memory. Jackie chose to shield them fiercely. She was determined that Caroline and John Jr. would have as normal a childhood as possible given the circumstances. She enrolled them in private schools. She surrounded them with trusted teachers and tutors. She created spaces in her home where they could be children, where the tragedy of their past did not have to define every moment. She was also determined that they would not grow up bitter about their loss. She wanted them to remember their father fondly, to understand his legacy, to feel proud of what he had accomplished, but not to be crushed by what had been taken from them. Jackie herself was grieving deeply, but she hid much of that grief from her children. She had to be strong for them. She had to be the anchor that kept them grounded. She had to be the parent who had all the answers, even when she had none. It was an enormous burden to carry. But Jackie seemed to understand that this was the price of her role as the widow of an assassinated president and the mother of his traumatized children. Jackie also made an important decision about the Kennedy legacy. She commissioned the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination and determine what had happened. She wanted the truth to come out, even if that truth was painful. She wanted her children to grow up knowing the facts about their father's death, not living in a fog of mystery and speculation. She worked with historians and biographers to document her husband's presidency and his life. She wanted Caroline and John Jr. to be able to understand their father not just as the man they had lost, but as a historical figure, a president who had made important contributions to American history. In many ways, Jackie Kennedy became the guardian of JFK's legacy. She protected it, shaped it, and ensured that it would be remembered favorably by history. But more importantly, she protected her children, giving them the space and the safety they needed to grow up and eventually come to terms with their loss. As Caroline Kennedy moved into her teenage years, she was a girl who had already experienced more trauma than most people do in a lifetime. She was intelligent, poised, and seemingly well-adjusted, but she carried within her a deep well of sadness that most of her peers could not understand. She attended Miss Porter's school, one of the most exclusive preparatory schools in the country. The school was in Connecticut, a beautiful, pastoral setting that was far removed from the intensity of New York City. It was a place where girls from the most prominent families in America came to be educated. Caroline fit in because of her background, her intelligence, and her grace. But she was also set apart by her tragedy. She was the girl whose father had been assassinated. She was the girl who had saluted his coffin on international television. She was the girl who was living with a loss that her peers could only imagine. By her teenage years, Caroline was developing into the woman she would become. She was serious, intellectually curious, and deeply interested in history and literature. She read voraciously. She was interested in political science and government. In many ways, she seemed to be following in her father's footsteps, developing the same intellectual interests, the same love of learning, the same curiosity about how the world worked. She was also developing a strong sense of social responsibility. She understood that her family name came with a legacy, with expectations, with a responsibility to use her privilege and her education to contribute to society. This sense of responsibility would shape the choices she made as an adult. Her mother was still her anchor, still the most important person in her life. Jackie was now living primarily in New York, raising her 2 children and managing the enormous burden of the Kennedy legacy. In 1968, when Caroline was 10 years old, another tragedy struck the Kennedy family. Her uncle, Robert F. Kennedy, who had become a senator and was running for president, was assassinated in Los Angeles. Once again, the Kennedy family was thrust into national trauma. Once again, a beloved family member was taken by assassination. Once again, Caroline had to confront the reality that tragedy seemed to follow her family like a curse. Robert Kennedy's assassination was particularly difficult for Caroline because she was old enough to understand more fully what it meant. She was old enough to grieve not just the loss itself, but to understand the larger implications of the loss. She understood that her family seemed to be targeted by tragedy in a way that was unusual and frightening. She understood that being a Kennedy meant living with a certain amount of danger and loss that most American children never had to contemplate. By age 10, Caroline Kennedy had lost her father and her uncle to assassination. She had learned that the world was not safe, that tragedy could strike without warning, that the people you loved could be taken from you at any moment. She had learned these lessons far earlier than any child should have to. Yet she continued to be a good student, a good daughter, a good sister. She seemed determined not to let her trauma define her completely. She seemed determined to honor her father and her uncle by living a life of meaning and purpose. Throughout her teenage years, Caroline was acutely aware that the world was watching her. She was the daughter of a dead president. She was the niece of another dead president. She was a symbol of the Kennedy family's tragedy. Photographers still tried to capture her image. Journalists still wanted to write about her. People still approached her with a mixture of sympathy and morbid fascination. But Caroline seemed to understand, in the way that intelligent young people can, that she had to create her own identity separate from these narratives. She had to figure out who she was beyond the tragedy, beyond the famous name, beyond the public symbolism. This was the work of her teenage years, understanding her loss, honoring her family's memory, and beginning to build a sense of self that was independent of the tragedy that had defined her childhood. By the time Caroline Kennedy reached her late teenage years and early adulthood, she had developed into a remarkable young woman. She was tall, beautiful, and intelligent. She had her mother's grace and her father's intellectual curiosity. She had experienced tragedy that would have broken many people, yet she seemed to have integrated that tragedy into her understanding of the world without letting it destroy her. She attended Radcliffe College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in America, affiliated with Harvard University. At Radcliffe, she studied history and political science, subjects that connected directly to her family's legacy, but that also reflected her genuine intellectual interests. She was a serious student, engaged with her coursework, interested in understanding how history worked, how power functioned in society, how individuals could make a difference in the world. At Radcliffe, she was surrounded by intelligent, accomplished young women who were shaping the future. She was part of a generation that was questioning authority, that was engaged in the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, that was thinking deeply about what it meant to be an American, what responsibility, wealth, and privilege entailed, what kind of contribution they could make to society. Caroline seemed to absorb all of this. She was intellectually engaged. She was serious about her studies. She was thinking about her future. But she was also dealing with the ongoing trauma of her father's and uncle's deaths. She was dealing with the reality that her mother had become a widow and was raising her and her brother alone. She was dealing with the weight of the Kennedy name, the Kennedy legacy, and the expectation that she would do something meaningful with her life. After graduating from Radcliffe, Caroline attended Harvard Law School. Again, this was a choice that reflected both her family's legacy and her own intellectual interests. Law seemed like a natural path for someone with her background, her intelligence, and her sense of social responsibility. Harvard Law School was where many of America's most influential leaders had been educated. It was where power was created, where people learned how to navigate the political and legal systems that governed American life. Caroline seemed to be on a trajectory toward a significant life. She was the daughter of a president. She was the niece of a senator. She was educated at the best schools in America. She seemed destined for importance, for influence, for a life lived at the highest levels of American society. But she was also determined to forge her own path, to create her own identity, to be more than just the daughter of a dead president. This determination would shape the choices she made in her 20s and 30s, and it would ultimately lead her toward a life that honored her family's legacy while creating something entirely her own. After law school, Caroline Kennedy chose not to pursue a traditional high-powered legal career in a prestigious law firm, though that would have been a natural path for someone with her credentials. Instead, she worked as a lawyer at a firm that had a more public interest focus. She was interested in using her education to serve others, not simply to accumulate wealth and power. This choice reflected something important about her character. Despite being born into enormous privilege, despite having every advantage that American society could offer, she seemed to understand that privilege came with responsibility. She seemed to understand that having been given so much meant she should give back. In her mid-20s, Caroline met Edwin Schlossberg, an author, designer, and intellectual who shared her interests in history, art, and culture. Schlossberg was not from a famous family. He was not connected to political power in the way that Caroline's family was. He was an accomplished man in his own right, but he was not a Kennedy. In some ways, this may have been exactly what Caroline needed. A partner who could see her as herself, not as the daughter of an assassinated president, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as Caroline Kennedy, a woman with her own interests, her own talents, her own dreams. They fell in love. They got married in 1986 in a relatively private ceremony, away from the intense media scrutiny that had surrounded most major Kennedy family events. Caroline was now in her late 20s, beginning to build a life of her own. She was no longer defined entirely by her losses. She was becoming a woman with her own identity, her own career, her own relationships. They had children together, 3 children who would be raised in a more private way than many Kennedy children had been raised. Caroline was attempting to give her own children the kind of normal childhood that her mother had tried to give her, even though that was difficult given the Kennedy name. She published books about her father, including Profiles in Courage for Our Time, which was a continuation of her father's famous work. She became involved in various cultural and philanthropic organizations. She worked on preserving her father's legacy while also creating her own professional identity. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, it seemed as though Caroline Kennedy had done something remarkable. She had survived the assassination of her father at age 5. She had survived the assassination of her uncle at age 10. She had grown up in the shadow of tragedy. And yet, she had become an accomplished woman in her own right. She had built a meaningful career. She had a loving marriage. She had children. She had built a life that was separate from the Kennedy tragedy, that honored her family's legacy, but that was not defined entirely by it. It seemed as though she had done what most people thought was impossible. She had taken her trauma and integrated it into her life in a way that allowed her to flourish. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The next tragedy was already approaching, waiting in the wings, preparing to strike the Kennedy family once again. Just when it seemed that Caroline Kennedy had found some stability, some peace, some sense of normalcy in her adult life, another tragedy began to develop. This time, it would not come from an assassin's bullet. It would come from within her own family, from a disease that would slowly and relentlessly consume the one person who had been her anchor through everything else. In 1975, Jackie Kennedy Onassis was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a serious form of cancer. The diagnosis came as a shock to the Kennedy family. Jackie had seemed invincible. She had survived the assassination of her husband. She had raised 2 traumatized children alone. She had managed the enormous burden of the Kennedy legacy. She had remarried, divorced, and built a life as a successful book editor in New York. She seemed like a woman who could survive anything. But cancer does not respect strength or resilience or the will to live. Cancer comes for everyone, regardless of how much they have already endured. At the time of her diagnosis, Jackie was 45 years old. Caroline was 17 years old, still in high school, still in the early stages of her adult life. John Jr. was 14 years old, a teenager struggling with his own identity and his own losses. Neither of them was prepared for what was coming. Jackie initially tried to keep her diagnosis private. She did not want the world to know that she was ill. She did not want to become a symbol of victimhood, a tragic figure battling disease. She wanted to continue living her life as normally as possible. She continued working at Viking Press, where she was a senior editor. She continued her philanthropic work. She continued to be a presence in New York's cultural and social circles. But the cancer was relentless. Over the course of nearly 20 years, from 1975 until her death in 1994, Jackie Kennedy would battle this disease. She would undergo chemotherapy and radiation. She would experience remissions, during which it seemed like she might beat the cancer, followed by relapses that would set her back. She would gradually grow weaker. She would gradually lose the physical vitality that had characterized her throughout her life. And Caroline Kennedy would watch all of this happen. Unlike the assassination of her father, which had been sudden and shocking, her mother's illness was a slow burn, a gradual decline, a prolonged goodbye that lasted nearly 2 decades. In some ways, this was harder. Caroline had time to understand what was happening. She had time to realize that she was losing her mother. She had time to grieve while her mother was still alive, the kind of anticipatory grief that comes when you know someone is dying, but they have not yet died. As her mother's illness progressed through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Caroline's role in the family transformed. She was no longer simply a daughter. She became a caregiver. She became an advocate. She became the person who had to make medical decisions, who had to coordinate her mother's care, who had to be present for her mother in the most intimate ways. Caroline was building her own life during these years. She was married to Edwin Schlossberg. She was having children. She was working as a lawyer. She was trying to establish her own career and her own family. But increasingly, she had to divide her attention and her energy between her own family and her mother's care. She had to be at medical appointments. She had to research treatments and doctors. She had to navigate the healthcare system on behalf of her mother. She had to be strong for her mother, even as she was dealing with her own fears and her own grief. This was a role reversal that is common in families, but it was particularly poignant in Caroline's case because she had already lost so much. She had already lost her father at age 5. She had already lost her uncle at age 10. Now, as an adult, she was losing her mother, the woman who had been her anchor, her protector, her guide through the traumas of her childhood. Jackie tried to maintain her dignity throughout her illness. She rarely allowed herself to be photographed during her final years. She protected her privacy fiercely, just as she had protected her children's privacy when they were young. She refused to become a public symbol of suffering or victimhood. But the cancer was taking its toll. She was losing weight. She was losing strength. She was gradually becoming more and more dependent on others, including her daughter. During this time, Caroline had to come to terms with the reality that the woman who had raised her, who had protected her, who had taught her how to survive tragedy with grace and dignity, was dying. She had to watch her mother become vulnerable in ways that her mother had never been vulnerable. She had to be the strong one, the one who had all the answers, the one who could provide comfort. This was an enormous burden for a woman who was still processing her own childhood traumas, who was still dealing with the loss of her father and her uncle, who was still trying to build her own life. But Caroline rose to the occasion. She was present for her mother. She was devoted to her mother's care. She was determined that her mother would not die alone, that her mother would know that she was loved and supported and cared for. The medical establishment continued to try various treatments. There were periods when it seemed like the cancer might be in remission, when there was hope that Jackie might recover, when the family allowed themselves to believe that she might beat the disease. But each time the cancer would return. Each time it would be stronger. Each time it would take another piece of Jackie's strength and vitality. The disease was a slow erosion, a gradual taking away, a prolonged goodbye. Through all of this, Caroline had to continue living her own life. She was raising children. She was working. She was managing her marriage and her career. But always there was the knowledge that her mother was sick, that her mother was dying, that one day she would lose her mother just as she had lost her father. The weight of this knowledge was enormous. She was living with both hope and grief simultaneously, hope that her mother would recover, grief that her mother was dying. She was holding both of these contradictory emotions at the same time, which is one of the hardest things a human being can do. By the spring of 1994, it became clear that Jackie Kennedy was not going to survive her illness. The cancer had progressed too far. The treatments had done all they could do. It was time to accept the inevitable and to begin the process of saying goodbye. Jackie was living in her apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan, the home that had been the center of her life for many years. She was surrounded by her children and by people who loved her. She was living quietly, with as much dignity as she could maintain, facing the end of her life with the same grace with which she had faced everything else. Caroline was there. She was at her mother's bedside during these final days. She was watching her mother prepare to die. She was preparing herself to lose her mother. And she was also preparing to lose the last living person who had been with her on November 22, 1963, the day her father was assassinated. Jackie was the only other adult who had lived through that day with her, who truly understood what it had meant, who had been there to help her survive it. Without her mother, Caroline would be truly alone in her grief, truly alone in her memory of her father. On May 19, 1994, Jackie Kennedy Onassis died. She was 64 years old. Caroline was 36 years old. She had now lost her father, her uncle, and her mother. She had experienced 3 major losses, 3 people she loved deeply, all dead, all taken from her, all leaving holes in her life that could never be filled. The death of her mother was different from the deaths of her father and uncle. It was not sudden. It was not shocking. It was not a national tragedy that was broadcast on every news channel. It was a private loss, a family loss, a loss that was grief-stricken but not public. Jackie had insisted on privacy during her illness, and the family honored that wish. But the loss was no less profound. In many ways, it was more profound because it had been so prolonged, because Caroline had watched it happen over nearly 20 years, because she had been intimately involved in every stage of her mother's decline. Caroline had to grieve not just the loss of her mother, but the loss of the long journey toward that loss. The funeral was held at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was a smaller, more private affair than state funerals for presidents or senators, but it was still attended by many important people, politicians, artists, intellectuals, and friends of the Kennedy family. The eulogies spoke of Jackie's grace, her intelligence, her strength, her remarkable ability to survive tragedy and to create beauty in the world. But for Caroline, the funeral was about something simpler and more profound. It was about saying goodbye to her mother, the woman who had been the center of her life since before she could remember. After the funeral, Caroline had to return to her own life. She had to return to her husband and her children. She had to return to her work. She had to figure out how to continue living in a world where her mother no longer existed. She had to add another name to the long list of people she had lost. She had to integrate another loss into her understanding of who she was and what her life meant. She was 36 years old. Her childhood trauma had happened when she was 5. Her uncle had died when she was 10. Her brother would die when she was 41. But for now, at 36, she was simply a woman who had just lost her mother, and she had to figure out how to live with that loss. After her mother's death in 1994, Caroline Kennedy entered a period that might have been the most stable of her adult life, even as she was processing new grief. She had her marriage to Edwin Schlossberg, which seemed strong and stable. She had her 3 children who were growing up and developing into their own people. She had her work as a lawyer and her involvement in various cultural and philanthropic organizations. She had begun to build something that looked like a normal life, a life separate from tragedy, a life defined by creation rather than loss. She published books, including Profiles in Courage for Our Time, which continued her father's literary legacy. She became involved in various organizations dedicated to the arts and to preserving her family's legacy. She seemed to be channeling her grief into meaningful work. She seemed to be finding purpose in honoring the memory of those she had lost. The years from 1994 to 1999 might have been years of gradual healing. Caroline was in her 30s and 40s. She was an adult woman who had survived enormous trauma and who was building a meaningful life. She had created distance from the immediate trauma of her childhood losses. She had raised children. She had built a career. She had built a marriage. She had created something that looked like stability and happiness. Her younger brother, John Jr., was also building a life for himself. He had become a lawyer and an entrepreneur. He had founded George Magazine, a publication that blended politics and popular culture in innovative ways. John Jr. was handsome, charismatic, and seemed to be carving out his own path, separate from the Kennedy political legacy. He was living his own life, making his own choices, creating his own identity. In 1996, John Jr. married Carolyn Bessette, a beautiful and accomplished woman who worked in public relations. The wedding was a major Kennedy family event. Caroline was there to celebrate her brother's marriage. She was happy for him. She was glad that he had found someone to love, someone to build a life with. For the first time in her adult life, Caroline Kennedy seemed to have found something like peace. She had survived the assassination of her father. She had survived the assassination of her uncle. She had survived the long, slow death of her mother. She had built her own life, separate from these traumas. She had created something meaningful. She had created something beautiful. She had created a future that was not entirely defined by the past. But life, as it often does, was not finished testing her. Life was not finished taking from her. The greatest loss of her adult life was still to come. On the evening of July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy, Jr. decided to fly his Piper Saratoga airplane from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard. He was going to attend his cousin Rory Kennedy's wedding. It was a short flight, something John had done many times before. He was an experienced pilot. The weather was hazy, but not impossible. He brought his wife Carolyn with him and her sister Lauren. It should have been a simple journey. It should have been an evening flight followed by a weekend family celebration. But it would be the last flight John Kennedy, Jr. ever took. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, between the New Jersey coast and Martha's Vineyard, something went wrong. The Piper Saratoga descended rapidly into the water. There was no distress call. There was no warning. The plane simply disappeared from radar. Within hours, the aviation authorities realized that a plane was missing. Within more hours, they realized whose plane it was: John F. Kennedy, Jr. The son of President Kennedy, the brother of Caroline Kennedy, was missing over the Atlantic Ocean. The news spread like a shock wave across America. Once again, the Kennedy family was plunged into national trauma. Once again, tragedy had struck. Once again, the world was watching. Massive search and rescue operations were launched immediately. Boats and helicopters searched the waters around Martha's Vineyard. The Coast Guard, the Navy, and private search teams all worked frantically to find the plane and its passengers. The entire nation watched and waited, hoping against hope that John Jr. and his wife and her sister had somehow survived, had somehow made it to an island, had somehow found a way to survive this disaster. For days, there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe they survived. Maybe they found land. Maybe they would be found alive. The media coverage was intense and constant. Every news network was covering the story. Every moment of new information was broadcast live to millions of people. The suspense was almost unbearable. And then, on July 22, 1999, 6 days after the plane disappeared, divers recovered the bodies of John F. Kennedy, Jr. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and her sister Lauren from the wreckage of the plane on the ocean floor. They had not survived. They had died in the crash. John Jr. was 38 years old. Caroline Kennedy was 41 years old. She was the last surviving member of her generation of Kennedys. She was now completely alone. The last person who had shared her childhood, who had lived through the assassination of their father with her, who had been at the same dinner table watching their mother die of cancer, was gone. John Jr. was not simply her brother. He was her only sibling. He was the only other person in the world who could truly understand what it meant to be her, what it meant to be a Kennedy, what it meant to lose so much so early and to have to somehow continue living. With his death, something fundamental shifted in Caroline's life. She was no longer part of a sibling unit. She was no longer one of two. She was alone. The funeral was held at the Church of St. Thomas More on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the same neighborhood where their mother had lived, the same neighborhood that had been the center of the Kennedy family's life in New York. The funeral was attended by thousands of people. It was broadcast on television. It was mourned by millions. The death of John Jr. became a national event, comparable in media saturation and public emotion to the assassination of his father nearly 36 years earlier. And at the center of all of this was Caroline Kennedy, mourning the loss of her only brother, mourning the loss of the last person who understood her, mourning the loss of her entire family except for her children. The photographs from that funeral show a woman devastated, a woman who had lost everything, a woman who had to somehow find the strength to continue living in a world that had taken nearly everything from her. In the weeks and months following her brother's death in July 1999, Caroline Kennedy had to confront a reality that few people in the world ever have to face. She was 41 years old. She had lost her father at age 5. She had lost her uncle at age 10. She had lost her mother at age 36. And now, she had lost her only sibling at age 41. She was the last surviving member of her generation of Kennedys. She was the keeper of her family's history, the witness to their tragedies, the living link to the most famous American family of the 20th century. The weight of this responsibility was enormous. She was also a widow, not in the traditional sense, but in a very real way. Her brother had been her anchor, her connection to her past, the only other person in the world who shared her specific experiences. With his death, she lost that anchor. She lost that connection. She lost that understanding. In the immediate aftermath of John Jr.'s death, Caroline had to process not just her grief, but also the reality of what she had lost and what that loss meant for her future. She had to think about what it meant to be the last Kennedy of her generation. She had to think about what obligations she had to her family's legacy. She had to think about how to honor the memory of all the people she had lost: her father, her uncle, her mother, and now her brother. Grief is not a linear process. People often talk about grief as if it has stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. As if you move through these stages and then you are done grieving and you can move on with your life. But anyone who has experienced profound loss knows that this is not how grief works. Grief comes in waves. It returns unexpectedly. Anniversaries become painful again. Photographs bring tears. Dreams revisit the people you have lost. Grief is something you learn to carry, not something you eventually put down and leave behind. Caroline had to learn to carry the weight of her multiple losses. She had to learn to live with the knowledge that nearly everyone she had loved was gone. She had to learn to be the survivor, the one left behind, the one who had to make meaning out of the tragedies that had defined her life. In the months after her brother's death, Caroline spent time with her children. She spent time with her extended family. She spent time processing what had happened, understanding what it meant, and beginning to figure out how to continue living. She did not disappear into grief, though she might have been excused for doing so. She did not withdraw from the world, though she had every reason to. Instead, she began to think about how to use her experience, her knowledge, her understanding of loss and survival to contribute something meaningful to the world. One of the ways that Caroline Kennedy processed her grief and began to build a new life after her brother's death was through writing. Writing had always been important to her. She had published books before. She had used the written word as a way to make sense of her experiences, to honor her family's legacy, and to communicate her ideas to the world. In the years following 1999, Caroline became more prolific as a writer. She published Profiles in Courage for Our Time, a continuation of her father's famous work. The book featured essays about contemporary Americans who had shown moral courage, who had stood up for their principles even when it cost them something. The book was a way for Caroline to think about what courage meant, what it meant to live with integrity, what it meant to do the right thing even when it was difficult. But the book was also, on a deeper level, a meditation on Caroline's own life and her own experiences. She was thinking about courage because she had had to demonstrate courage herself. Courage to survive the assassination of her father, courage to watch her mother die of cancer, courage to continue living after the death of her brother. She was thinking about integrity and principle because she had been raised by parents and grandparents who valued these things. She was thinking about how to live a meaningful life in the face of tragedy and loss. Through her writing, Caroline began to heal. She began to process her grief. She began to find meaning in her losses. She began to understand her life not as a series of random tragedies, but as a narrative with coherence and meaning. She began to see the connections between her personal experiences and the larger currents of American history and culture. She published other books as well. She edited collections of her father's speeches and writings. She worked with historians and biographers to document the Kennedy presidency and the Kennedy family's role in American history. She became, in many ways, the official keeper of the Kennedy legacy. She was the one who decided what would be preserved, what would be published, how her family's history would be remembered. This was a significant responsibility, but it was also therapeutic. It allowed her to remain connected to her family, to honor their memory, and to ensure that their legacies would not be forgotten. Through her writing and her editorial work, Caroline Kennedy began to build a new identity for herself. She was no longer simply the daughter of an assassinated president or the sister of a man who died in a plane crash. She was becoming a serious writer, a thoughtful commentator on American life and history, a woman who was using her unique perspective and her unique experiences to contribute something meaningful to the culture. She was healing through creation. She was finding meaning through the act of bringing new work into the world. She was honoring those she had lost by preserving their legacy and by using her talents to illuminate their lives and their contributions to American history. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, as Caroline served as ambassador and continued her work as a writer and cultural advocate, she began to develop a clear sense of purpose. She understood that she had been given enormous advantages in life. She had been born into one of America's most famous families. She had received an elite education. She had access to resources and opportunities that most people could never dream of. But she had also experienced tragedy and loss that few people could understand. She had been shaped by these experiences. She understood, on a fundamental level, what it meant to lose people you loved. She understood what it meant to grieve. She understood what it meant to continue living in the face of unbearable loss. And she understood that she had a responsibility to use these experiences, to use her advantages, to contribute something meaningful to the world. Caroline became involved in numerous philanthropic and cultural organizations. She served on boards. She supported causes that she believed in. She used her platform, her name, and her resources to advocate for the arts, for education, for the preservation of historical memory. She became a significant figure in American cultural life, not because of who her father was or because of the tragedies her family had experienced, but because of her own thoughtfulness, her own commitment to excellence, and her own desire to make a positive difference in the world. She gave speeches, she wrote articles, she participated in cultural events and conferences. She was not seeking the spotlight. In fact, she seemed to deliberately avoid it, but her voice, when she spoke, was listened to. Her words, when she wrote them, were read carefully. People respected her not simply because she was a Kennedy, but because of what she had to say, because of her intelligence, because of her obvious commitment to the issues she cared about. One of the most significant ways that Caroline channeled her experience was through her work on grief, mourning, and historical memory. She understood, in a way that few people do, the importance of honoring those who have died, of preserving their memory, of creating spaces where people can grieve and remember. She worked to preserve historical sites. She advocated for the proper maintenance and interpretation of historical landmarks. She believed that how we remember the past shapes how we understand the present and how we build the future. She also understood, perhaps from her own experience, that grief is not something that should be hidden or suppressed. She believed that as a society, we need to talk about loss, we need to acknowledge grief, we need to create spaces where people can express their sadness and their loss openly. She became, in many ways, an advocate for a more honest and open conversation about death and mourning in American culture. This work was not done for publicity. It was not done to draw attention to herself. It was done quietly, consistently, as part of her ongoing commitment to using her life and her experience to contribute something meaningful to the world. Through her diplomatic service, her writing, her philanthropic work, and her cultural advocacy, Caroline Kennedy demonstrated that it is possible to survive tremendous tragedy and to build a meaningful life afterward. She demonstrated that you do not have to let your losses define you entirely. She demonstrated that you can take the weight of your history and transform it into something constructive. She demonstrated that resilience is not about never breaking. It is about finding ways to continue living, to continue creating, to continue serving, even in the face of unbearable loss. Caroline Kennedy is now in her late 60s. She is still living. She is still working. She is still honoring the memory of those she has lost. She is still serving. She is still being present for her children and her grandchildren. She is still facing the challenges that life presents to her. The story of her life is not finished. The story of her losses is not finished. But the story of her resilience, the story of her grace, the story of her commitment to living meaningfully despite her losses, that story is one of the most important stories in American culture. It is a story that reminds us that we are more resilient than we know. It is a story that reminds us that tragedy does not have to destroy us. It is a story that reminds us that it is possible to survive extraordinary loss and still build something beautiful from it. If you were moved by the story of Caroline Kennedy, if you were inspired by her resilience and her grace, if you recognized in her story something about the human capacity to survive and to continue living in the face of unbearable circumstances, then please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more documentaries about the remarkable people who have shaped American history and American culture. In the comments below, tell us what you think about Caroline Kennedy's life. Tell us what you learned from her story. Tell us how her example of resilience has affected you. Share your own stories of loss and survival. Let us create a community of people who understand that tragedy is not the end of our story, that resilience is a practice, that it is possible to live meaningfully even in the face of tremendous grief. And remember this: Caroline Kennedy's life teaches us that the measure of a human being is not what happens to them, but how they respond to what happens to them. It is not the losses they suffer, but what they choose to do with those losses. It is not the weight they carry, but how they carry it. Caroline Kennedy has carried the weight of extraordinary loss with grace, dignity, and a commitment to living fully and meaningfully. She has turned her tragedy into meaning. She has turned her grief into wisdom. She has turned her losses into a foundation for serving others and contributing to the world. And in doing so, she has become one of the most inspiring figures in American history, not because of who she was born as, but because of who she has chosen to become.